Well, if you listen to Farm to Table Talk, you'll recognize that I've got a lot of interest in small farms. It's not that I'm against big farms, but there's a lot of people that would like to be farmers and they have special needs on a small farm basis. And there's a lot of consumers that would like to deal more locally and get acquainted with smaller farms. And even restaurants are all tied in. And fortunately, there are institutions like land grant universities, Extension Service, the U.S. Department of Agriculture that have been encouraging and supporting some of that. Maybe nobody is as out on the front end of this as much as Cornell has been for many years. And I'm really happy to welcome today Erica Frenay. And Erica, I pronounce your last name right?
Yeah.
Frenay? Okay. Well, I got Erica right too, so I'm happy. Hey, it's nice to visit with you. You're in New York and I'm in California, and we both have an interest in small farms. And in my small way, I try to promote them and share stories about who's making it work and how difficult it is sometimes. I can't even count the number of people that told me I'd sure love to farm. I'd love to have a small farm. There's just special problems. It's not easy. And I've seen people looking around and saying, who could give me a hand? And
Mm.
and it seems to me, Erica, that possibly Cornell's one of those places where you can give a hand, either education, information, coaching, encouragement, research, the whole thing. So tell me about what's going on. That's what a terrible question for you, though. I'm just like throwing it wide open. It's like, okay, how do we get into this broad area? So, what do you do at Cornell that has something to do with small farms?
Yeah, so the Cornell Small Farms program was created in 2001. And like you said, we are the Small Farms program, but it doesn't mean that we're against big farms. It's just that there was no entity to advocate for and support small farms. And if you use the USDA's definition of a small farm, which is any farm that grosses less than $350,000 in revenue per year, that's actually over 90% of all farms are considered small. And
Wow.
so we were created to be a clearinghouse, a voice, an ear. We started in the first couple decades that we were around. We did a lot of listening all around New York State and even regionally, trying to understand what are some of those sticky problems that face small farms that maybe are different than what bigger farms face. And then kind of having that landscape view where we really are connectors, and we observe who's doing what and where connections could be made, where there are gaps. And so we help small farms at any stage and really at any scale, honestly, to access resources and expert assistance with their needs. And sometimes that means connecting them with an information resource or with a person. We work very closely with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and our work honestly would not be possible without a whole network of extension service providers all over the state. But sometimes we'll notice that there is a gap in information. So an example of that is very early on, I think it was around 2006, we were hearing that there was lots of interest in people starting new farms, and they were contacting their county cooperative extension office. But the extension offices at that time, most of them didn't really have any information resources to offer these new farmers. And so we're hearing this from many different sources. So we put together a team of extension educators, some of whom were already offering trainings for beginning farmers, and we helped them to mentor their neighbors in other counties. And
Mhm.
then we looked around at what sort of questions were new farmers asking, and could we develop an information source that would help to answer some of those questions. A lot of the first questions that new farmers ask are things like, where can I get a grant to start my
Mhm.
farm?
Sure.
Uh, or how do I find land? What do I produce? What's going to be profitable? Things like that. And so we were very lucky. I'm based in Tompkins County, New York. And there was an educator here named Monica Roth who had developed a pretty small, I think it was maybe like 13 fact sheets, but it was the very basics of what she called the Guide to Farming in New York.
Hmm.
We had a team of people who sort of looked at that and expanded on it and created this much larger document, the Guide to Farming in New York, which has now around 36 fact sheets in it and helps give beginning farmers at least the most basic information, not about production, but just about the sort of invisible structures, what you need to know, how you get financing, what are the regulations that they need to follow, and then points them towards other resources, links to state websites or, regulatory sites and other entities that can help them.
Are there any like demonstration projects you have? I know some of the other agriculture and land-grant universities have research plots going at different spots and research farms, but is there any place they can go and like see a demonstration farm or something that's operating at the scales that they aspire to?
No, I mean, we have talked about that throughout our history, but it's just there's so many variables and different factors that go into what scale and what sort of enterprise people start on their farm. Like it's just so diverse
Yeah.
that we didn't really think that it was worth trying to build some sort of model farm. However, because we are part of a land grant university, and we do have access to research farm land, we have over time engaged in much more specific research. So our director, Anu Rangarajan, wears multiple hats. One of her hats is that she's also a state vegetable specialist, and she's always been really interested in no-till and low-till vegetable farming, especially organic
Hmm.
no-till and low-till vegetable farming. And so for many years, she was running a research program based at some of Cornell's research farms and would often do field days where people could come out and see, this is how you can, this is what we've learned, and this is how you can improve your soil and still produce really great crops and reduce labor by using no-till techniques, for example.
You know, one of the things I've noticed is that you run into a lot of people that are interested in this that instead have jobs currently that are inside all the time. And part of what appeals to them is to not be stuck in a cubicle or a small office and would like to be able to get out, get fresh air and so forth. So that starts some people thinking about it. And they think, gee, what would it take if I could be kind of out and have something? And then they find something eventually. Maybe they get a small acreage, or they read from what you're doing. But it's one of the things that comes to it fairly quickly is most people can't make enough money from the farm. It's certainly not initially. And so part of the challenge, it would seem, is how do you get all the work done when you've got to be spending 40 hours a week somewhere else, maybe? And then you're forced to try to do chores at night before the sun goes down, or get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do some things, and give up your vacations and all of that. So I would imagine you have to do some coaching of like, hang in there, hang in there. You're
Yeah.
not the only one trying to do this.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is how a lot of people, I think, arrive at this dream of having a farm. And so, one of the things that we did early on, I think our first course was in 2007, is we started offering online courses for farmers.
Mhm.
And I'll be the first person to tell you, like, do not learn how to farm online. Like it's not the ideal
Right,
way to learn about farming, right?
right.
But what we've noticed is that these courses fill a niche for
Hmm.
people who are working full-time jobs but are nurturing this dream, or maybe geographically wherever they're located, there isn't any kind of support network. Like maybe their local cooperative extension does not offer classes or farm tours, and they don't know the local farm community, and so they're just not connected. So we now have this portfolio of over 36 online courses. I only teach one of them, but the one I teach is for the person that you just described. It's like the so you think you want to farm, what's involved exactly and how might you go about it, and a little bit more background, like what exactly is this industry, this small farm industry that you're thinking about joining. It's called BF 101, and we tackle topics like finding land and getting money to farm, and how do you learn how to farm, and
Yeah.
decision making is a huge piece of it, because all humans have to make lots of decisions every day. But when you're a farmer, especially if you're trying to run a farm business, your decision making has to be especially uh, honed and skillful, because you're going to make thousands of decisions, way more than a normal human does to get through their day. And if you are not making decisions that are taking into account your financial and ecological and your social needs, then you're quickly going to kind of get yourself into some trouble. So I tell people that the point of the BF 101 course is to help them remove the rose-colored glasses,
Yeah.
which they might not even realize they're wearing, because they're sitting in a cubicle and dreaming about farming and thinking that it's all going to be beautiful and like what you see on Instagram or something.
Yeah.
And the reality, of course, is a
Well,
lot
the other
harder.
thing, when you're in that transition from the dream, many of these people have other people in the household other than themselves. They may have a partner, a spouse, children, and when they take this plunge, many of them have to get into it. So I would imagine somebody's going to have to coach them a little bit and saying, wait a minute, you're not all going to agree all the time, but somebody's got to
Yeah.
go do this and that.
Well, I advocate, I have a background in holistic management,
Mhm.
which is all about decision making in the face of complexity. And Holistic Management International, based in New Mexico, is who I trained with. And I feel like the framework that they offer for helping, whether it's a family or business partners or an organization or whatever, like uh, they mostly focus on farms and ranches, but honestly, the decision-making framework that they offer could be useful for anybody anywhere, but especially for people who are managing land and getting into something as intensive as farming together and have to make lots of decisions and try to avoid conflict and make sure that it's as harmonious as possible, and that everybody's getting what they need from it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, it's exciting. I think when the people I've talked to before, they they celebrate kind of their transitions. One of the first things that happens is a family where there's maybe one or the other of a partner would be able to quit their day job. They cut way
Mhm.
back, and so they only have one person. And then I've talked to a couple before, and they said we're 1 year away from. In this case, it was his wife was getting ready to be able to be full time on the farm too, and that is quite an accomplishment. Um,
Absolutely.
because then you get all these other issues like insurance and things and benefits that are available to a job. So it's nice to know that somebody's there, and I think that that you're there to help them and they don't feel lost. The other thing too is I've noticed over the years that as there's been larger and larger scale in the industry, that you end up having the really, really big farms that have gotten extremely huge. They go to other states to get information. I mean, they don't necessarily have much interaction with local extension or even necessarily the local land grant universities. They may say, well, Purdue's got the specialty in this, or North Carolina State does, and they just pick up the phone or fly out to there. So it's this level, like you were pointing out at the beginning, that is like 80% of all the farmers in the country would be considered small farms that really needs help like yours. So it must feel rewarding to be there when people need you so much and probably appreciate what you're doing for them too.
I feel like we spend most of our time thinking about how many of the needs we're not able to support, because the needs are so great. And especially, for new entrants now, like access to land is,
Yeah,
it's always been critical. It's always been one of the big three barriers, but it feels like it just keeps getting harder and harder, because land is not valued for its agricultural value, right? Like it's valued for development. And so this ideal that many people with a farm dream hold of owning their own farmland
Yeah.
is increasingly not possible. It's just not within reach. And so there are incredibly creative and innovative strategies that have emerged for people to gain, creatively gain access to land. But those can also be fraught because a lot of times they don't offer any kind of equity building opportunity for the farmer, or they're not secure. And if a farmer has the sort of operation that requires building a lot of infrastructure, that can
Mhm.
be actually problematic. And, and some of it also starts to feel really like a throwback to serfdom and um, with the land owning class and then the people working the land. And that's not our vision of what we're trying to create either. So that's really challenging. And we also have seen over the years too, like who has been left out of the farm dream. And there are, a lot of like people of color, military veterans, a lot of the agricultural workforce in this country, many of whom are Latin American, and have not been traditionally part of. Either they've been actively excluded from, like, if you look at the statistics around Black farmers in this country and how land has been stolen from them over time, and Black land loss has increased since the 1920s, just over the past century. But they're also just not part of many of the training programs for new farmers because they haven't felt like they were welcomed in those. And so our program has been trying to, build relationship and build trust and develop programs and resources specifically to help audiences that have felt really marginalized and excluded from agricultural opportunities.
It makes me wonder whether there's an opportunity to go to senior citizens and retirement homes and others, because there's many people that have retired that were farmers that moved to town, and sometimes they've lost a spouse, and and the people that come knocking at the door that are going to cash rent their farm are large farms that want to just get a lot larger, or somebody that'll even take land and put it in a conservation reserve program and draw some cash from that, and they're able to kind of be very aggressive. Where on the other hand, some of these folks that have already retired and perhaps maybe in senior living or something could say, I could help some smaller farms get started, some younger families get on their feet and make our land available, and not necessarily just to the highest bidder that's adding it to thousands of acres they already have already. Does anybody target communications to that audience?
Yeah, we've definitely seen some examples, some really beautiful examples. It is tricky because the landowner, the farmer who's now retired, or as you said, perhaps living in a senior living facility or something, for many of them, the land is all they have. It's their sole asset. And so they do need
True.
to extract some value from that. It's something I'm in my little local community, the town of Caroline. I serve on the ag committee, and we're looking at that very issue because we just developed a report on ag and farmland protection in our town. And the statistics are a little bit alarming because over time we're noticing that a lot more of the land that is actively farmed in this town is being rented. And we don't know what the future plans are of the owners of that land.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still going to be available to those farmers in the future. So it's really fraught. The farmer has to have some financial flexibility to potentially not just take the highest offer on
Mm-hmm.
their land. They also probably have to have some kind of deeply held value about the sort of legacy they want to leave, and about like seeing that land stay in farming if it's possible. We at the Cornell Small Farms program just produced a short video. I can send you the link to it. And it's a really, really beautiful story about an older farmer. I don't remember if he was like fourth generation or something. His name is Tom. This is in the Catskills. He had no heirs, has no heirs, I should say, and started thinking years ago, like, what's my legacy here going to be? What's going to be the future of my land? And he had farmed dairy farming his whole life, had traded out hill ground for nicer ground over the years. So he had amassed a really nice collection of, I think, like 200 acres or so of really good farmland. So he started working with the American Farmland Trust to protect
Mhm.
that land. And ultimately, they created, he also worked with the Catskills Agrarian Alliance, which is a grassroots organization that we have enormous respect for. And they created a new entity called the West Branch Commons. And somehow in this process, he got connected with a person named C, who lives in the Bronx. And now C is farming on that land. I think the ultimate intention is that the land will be an incubator farm for multiple small farms to get started. But it's just like the relationship that C and Tom have cultivated is a lot like a father-daughter relationship. And yet they come from very different worlds and hold very different worldviews, but they respect each other and have been working together to try to, establish the legacy and the future for this farmland.
I love stories like that.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it just works. It's a win-win. People can feel better about the fact that they have some legacy. They're helping somebody get started. And anyway, well, that's great. Now, it's your work isn't limited, is it, to the country? I mean, there's urban agriculture as well, and community gardens and all sorts of things. So do you have engagement in the urban scene?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we just released a set of urban agriculture online courses that our director, Anu Rangarajan, worked with a few other folks, I think from University of Wisconsin, and Yolanda Gonzalez, who's a Harvest New York, like essentially a cooperative extension person based in New York City, to develop these courses. We also have had for, I guess, the last 5 years or so, a program called Community Mushroom Educators that was teaching people how to cultivate mushrooms. And even though I don't think the original intention was that it was an urban ag program. It seems that the majority of the people who participated in it came from urban spaces. And so we offered 3 different cohorts specifically for people who are already tied to a community and are seen as sort of leaders in that community, to help them learn how to be educators about mushroom cultivation. And many of them have after taking that training, they've now implemented projects in their communities.
That's
Um,
great.
so yeah, we're having lots of fun with that. We're the funding for that program ran out, and we're now like working to reinvigorate it and working with a group of leaders from that community mushroom educator group and envisioning what comes next.
Well, to do all these good things, you have to get funded. And I would imagine there's the New York legislature and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the New York Department of Agriculture. You have to be drawing on a lot of different sources to keep your programs going. And if you've been doing this yourself over 19 years, that's included some changes in administration in Washington, and and so it, do you see much variation? Is the support growing, or is it something you have to be constantly worried about to get enough to keep these programs going, to educate legislators and to educate Congress and to have a relationship with USDA and get grant money and that sort of thing? That's a huge job in itself, isn't it?
It is. We're very lucky though. I mean, it feels like my background before I came to this job was with scrappy little grassroots startup nonprofits. Um, and so to me, it still feels like even though we're always trying to figure out where our funding is going to come from next, and that's just that's a sort of a never ending project, mostly handled by our director, Anu. but with support from the rest of the team, it still feels like an enormous privilege to be at a large institution like Cornell, where you at least have the reputation of a land grant university behind you when you are going after grants. And it's only in the last 5 years or so, we were pretty much entirely grant funded for most of the time that I have been at the Small Farms program. And we do have, from the online courses, sufficient revenue to support my position. So for a while, I was off of that grant treadmill, just working on running the online courses. But it's in the last 5 years that we started to get support from the New York State legislature. And that was a big learning curve for us. But again, being part of a land grant university, we had good support for that. And I think it's always, you never know what's going to happen if the leadership at the state level changes, the leadership at the national level changes. What is that going to mean for us? I don't know. We just try to stay on our toes.
Well, it's interesting. There's already speculation because we're in an election cycle, and I was hearing some analysis the other day that was saying that, depending on the outcome, that one side, which we could kind of guess which side it is already making noise about trying to do more support of small farms and local packing plants and that sort of thing. Which brings up the other issue too, and that is that if you get them, if they're getting started and they're producing food, but the marketing needs special help too, I suppose. I mean, people can kind of get it if they're producing produce and they take it to a farmer's market, and there's much they can learn about that. But if they have livestock and they have to have the meat processed and marketed, do you have a role to play in helping them solve that dilemma of finding places to process their products?
Yeah, it's hard because we don't have a lot of control over it, but it is an issue that has been identified for as long as I've been at the Small Farms program. It's definitely a hot button issue for small livestock farmers. And because I am a small livestock farmer myself, I definitely sort of have a deep personal understanding of how stressful it is when you, especially during COVID, like all of a sudden it was impossible to get dates with slaughterhouses. And even now, I have dates for animals that aren't even born yet. Like
No, that is,
I have dates, I have butcher dates for animals that haven't even been conceived yet.
oh my
So
goodness.
Um, so it's very tricky. I feel very grateful to be part of a group of Cornell Cooperative Extension educators who are all interested in this issue of meat processing. So I'm part of a livestock team statewide of Cornell Cooperative Extension folks. And then we have a subcommittee that is specifically focused on meat processing issues. And we have somebody from New York State Department of Ag and Markets who's part of that. Some folks who work on the Cornell campus in the economics department, and then a lot of extension educators. And so, we've done things like survey all of the slaughterhouses in New York State and try to understand what their biggest challenges are. And without a doubt, the number one issue that's emerged has been labor for them.
Mm.
And then we've worked with the state. New York State had an MPEG, it was a meat processing expansion grant program last year, and a team of us worked to provide support to that program and evaluate proposals. So we've been advocating for a position that would provide some business planning support to slaughterhouses because they are such a critical piece of the marketing and processing for livestock farmers. So we're hoping that sometime in the next few years, maybe we'll be able to get that position funded, because while farmers have an entire extension system to rely on, the slaughterhouses don't. They don't really have, there's consultants that they can pay, but they don't really have a parallel extension system that farmers do.
And we don't have a farm bill passed at the time we're having this, and I don't know when we're going to get one, but it does seem like both parties seem to be supportive of continuing to get support out to get meat processing plants. So the grant money, and if they can just get a farm bill through, that's important. But still, somebody's got to do it. Somebody's either got to take an existing facility or build one. And I'm wondering, that's another frontier, isn't it? I mean, that the you could help farmers themselves say, look, nobody else is going to do it. Let's form a cooperative. Let's have our own packing plant or something like that. Do you get pulled into those discussions?
Not too much. Our capacity to provide really specific and in-depth support at that level is really limited. So we would probably suggest that people work with like Cornell has a staff person who works on agricultural cooperatives, or work with their local extension office. But when you first mentioned marketing and like people who grow produce going to a farmer's market, I was thinking that we've noticed in the last decade or so a shift in interest among farmers that this whole idea of just growing stuff and taking it to a farmer's market. Still, there are plenty of people who are interested in that, but there are people who don't really want to have to do that, but they don't really know what are their other marketing options. And something that I struggled with, it was a scale question. I raised grass-fed lamb, and at a certain scale, when I was first getting started, I had enough of a farm customer base that I could sell all of the lambs I produced pretty easily direct to consumer. I didn't even have to go to markets. I mostly sell whole lambs. But then as I expanded, because I got into doing solar grazing and renting my flock out to graze under solar panels, I had a lot more animals, and I no longer could sell all of them direct to consumer, yet I wasn't large enough to meet the demand of like a co-op or a restaurant that wanted a steady supply of 3 to 4 lambs a week year round. And so we briefly met, a group of us who all raise sheep here in my area, met and talked about like, could we form a cooperative? But ultimately, none of us had the time and capacity to take on the formation of a project like that. But I hear it over and over again, and in particular with our Futuro and Ag project, which is serving Spanish-speaking folks throughout New York State who are interested in starting their own farms. There's huge interest in doing more cooperative endeavors and being able to scale up and serve larger markets in that way. And
You
we
know,
don't have support for it.
well, I'm going to do a podcast, I think, on this too, because that stage that you're talking about right now, people say, "Gee, how are we going to do this?" Because there are people that are just at the same spot that you've just described, and they get the idea of together with others owning their own processing plant, but do they have to be a 501(c)(3)? Do they have to? What does it take to be a cooperative? Do you have to be able to each member kick some money in to get the thing started? All of those things. They're just it's kind of a blank slate for most people. They see and feel the need, and then I'm sure they're going to need Cornell and UC Davis and the others to be able to be right there with them and saying, you can't necessarily pull it off the shelf and say, well, here is how you do this and how you got to do that. There's some real hands-on problem solving there that's necessary.
Yeah. Well, and we cautioned a lot of people. I mentioned it during COVID, especially in the first year in 2020, the meat processing bottleneck was unreal. And so we had an unprecedented number of farmers contacting us and saying, I want to start my own slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
And the challenges, what we tried to help them understand is that, just because you know how to farm and how to raise these animals doesn't mean you know anything about this other side of the meat processing and, packaging and everything. And if there is one industry that is even harder to make a living at than farming, I would say it's probably the slaughterhouse industry. And a lot of it is because of the labor challenge I already mentioned, but the seasonal flow, in this temperate climate, everybody wants to pull their animals off pasture, and it's deer hunting season, and a lot of the slaughterhouses process venison. And so from like late September through December or even January, the slaughterhouses are completely overwhelmed with more work than they can handle. but then you talk to them in April, May, June, and they're having trouble keeping the lights on and keeping their staff busy. And so, I think between the expense of meeting all the regulatory requirements and the sort of NIMBY stuff that people will deal with when trying to start a new slaughterhouse, and just getting everything in place, like for the most part, we have recommended against starting new slaughterhouses unless people have really done their homework and can really justify the business side of it, know that they're going to have enough throughput. And for all of that, honestly, there's a Niche Meat Processors Association, NMPAN, that is probably the best resource that we've leaned on when addressing questions like that.
What's it called?
The Niche Meat Processors. I don't know what the A stands for, and I think
Huh.
the NMPAN.
NMPAN.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to look them up. I think that's really, really interesting. The other problem, especially, I know something about lambs, and they're very seasonal. And so when you have the lambs, and when it's really is the best time to be enjoying the lamb, is a certain seasonality to it. And one of the problems I think that sheep industry has had over the years, for years, is that it tried to have a supply of 52 weeks based on feedlots. And since you're a lamb producer, you know that if you're just going to try to keep them around and keep feeding them, not only get more expense, but you're also getting them, fatter, and, they're not in the prime. So that, to me, one of the solutions too, you got to keep a packing plant doing something, I suppose, if you're shut down. But the other is creating demand for frozen. And, we're fighting a lot of our friends that are just saying, buy fresh, buy fresh, buy fresh. Well, there's certain products, especially when it's, you're tied to the rhythms of the season and the grasslands, that's not the best way to go. It's better off to get, freezer, but
And
that's another job.
I've never noticed any difference in quality or taste.
I don't either. I've
Well
got,
packaged frozen cut of meat. Yeah.
yeah, you just have to plan 2 or 3 days ahead of time to
Yeah.
put it out, or if you do. Now, one other thing that I think that in the area that you're in, there are some hills and some trees, and I think you get engaged in trying to integrate where trees need to come into pasture and vice versa. Could you explain that?
Sure. Yeah. Where I live, there's a strong interest among farmers in silvopasture, which is the productive combination of trees and livestock and pasture. There are two paths to silvopasture, and here in the Northeast, it's a very forested landscape. And so one of the paths is to skillfully thin a forest so that you can have pasture growing in the understory with enough sunlight access, and then to let animals in there. I don't have a forestry background, and so and I also don't manage any forest on my farm. So I've been more interested in the pathway that is planting trees into pasture, which is a little funny because I took over a piece of ground that had been unmanaged for about 30 or 40 years. And so I spent a lot of time taking trees out when we first started
Yeah,
here
yeah,
to
yeah.
establish pasture. But I attended a training in Pennsylvania last year with Trees for Grazers, and they're in Lancaster County and doing really amazing work, putting tens of thousands of trees into the ground on dairy farms. Silvopasture has so many benefits, it's hard to even know where to start naming them all. I mean, it's been listed by Project Drawdown across all industries as the #9 strategy for sequestering carbon. And
Really?
with increasingly hot, dry summers, it's really important. There's lots of scientific studies about the impacts of heat on livestock. And so having shade distributed throughout your pastures for livestock is really critical. And that's probably the main motivator for a lot of the dairy farms that Trees for Grazers is planting these trees on. But you can also plant them to be a replacement source of feed when your pastures dry up because of drought.
Wow.
And that's also something that interests me. So trees produce leaves, obviously. Some of those leaves are as nutritious as alfalfa. Mulberry, for example, is a super nutritious leaf and animals love it. And so you can manage the trees in such a way that the animals can eat directly from the tree or that you're cutting and carrying forage to them. But also there's a lot of trees that produce mast like nuts or fruits. Maybe not as applicable for sheep necessarily. I don't know. I'd be curious if my sheep would eat persimmons, for example,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
mulberry fruit, but certainly for pigs and poultry, um,
Or
you
goats. The goats will
yeah,
eat anything.
yeah, although goats, I don't know. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I feel like there's not as much experimentation happening with planting trees and what goats do to them. Goats are just so much more mischievous.
Yeah, that's
So,
true. That's true.
um,
But cleans up your poison ivy.
yes,
You know,
that's right.
it's so many areas. That's exciting what you're doing. And you've alluded to your own journey because I think you are showing me and the people listening today that you really deserve to be able to, you're walking the talk. You farm and you're in this program at Cornell. How does that go for you? How do you balance doing what you got to get done and to have the program at Cornell and be a farmer yourself?
Yeah, sometimes I think I must be a masochist, because it's a lot to juggle. When we first started this farm, the idea was that I would eventually quit my job at Cornell and be full-time on the farm. But because we started on a piece of land that had been neglected and abused before it was neglected, and had zero infrastructure. I mean, literally not a fence, no electric source, no structures whatsoever. We knew that we were going to need off-farm jobs, the income from off-farm jobs in order to build all of that infrastructure. And so we had this kind of 10-year plan of gradually building up the farm, adding a new enterprise every year, building our market, our customer base. And then eventually I would quit my job and be full-time on the farm. But when that point actually arrived about 5 years ago, the Cornell Small Farms program had been growing also throughout that whole time. So it used to just be my boss and I, Anu and I, and we have added, I think we're now a team of like 15 people. And I genuinely adore all of the people I work with, and the work has gotten more diverse and more interesting. And I realized that I actually didn't want to be full-time on the farm.
Yeah.
Um, and I really like the balance of having farm days and office days. And there's a lot that benefits my farm because I learn about things through my work with the
Yeah.
small farms program and my connections to people. And I think that my background having a farm also helps me be a better teacher and have a better understanding of what farmers are experiencing. So I think the two are really symbiotic, but it does make my schedule a lot crazier and more stressful than maybe it.
Well, you got this crazy schedule and you're working too hard, but you're happy. And I can tell you're getting delighted yourself from being able to see the progress. And it's still in front of you. And that's where I'd like to kind of wrap up here too. So what's going to be delighting you a few years down the road? I mean, if you look at this journey that you're on and what we've been describing here, and I was going to circle back in a few years, what would you hope will have happened over these next couple of years that will be a source of kind of delight about progress maybe that's made? I mean, what encourages you? What do you feel good about looking down the road?
Hmm. I like that question because I feel like I don't spend enough time in that space of looking forward. I get so mired in the day to day. But there are definitely some things that are really exciting me now that I'm looking forward to at work. One of them is that with my coworker, Connor Youngerman, who's our new agroforestry specialist, we just hired Connor in January. So in some ways, he's still just, like learning the lay of the land and meeting people and everything. But he has become really passionate about mulberries as a silvopasture crop. One thing I didn't mention about silvopasture here in the US anyway, is that there is very little to no foundational research about like best practices for silvopasture systems here in the temperate part of the US. There's an abundant amount of research from tropical places about specific species, especially like mulberry, but nothing here in the Northeast. And right now, farmers have, because of climate smart commodities funding from the federal government and the Inflation Reduction Act, there is an enormous flow of funding for farmers to implement agroforestry practices. And silvopasture is one practice under the umbrella of agroforestry. So farmers are being enticed to do these things, to put trees in the ground, for example, but with very little guidance that is backed by science and very little technical support. And so we're working on a proposal right now to do some really foundational research on white mulberry as a silvopasture crop. And we are also working to build a network of people, not only at Cornell, but there's a lot of other folks working for grassroots organizations and federal and state agencies who are all very interested in silvopasture as a practice and are hearing the interest from the ground up, like from the farmers that they interact with, and wanting to know, how do they learn more? How do they get involved? What can they be doing to support these farmers? And so I'm really excited to be working in that space because it feels like there's a ton of energy around it. I also feel very energized and excited by the Futuro and Ag team at the Cornell Small Farms Program. My colleagues, Mildred Alvarado, who's the director of that effort, Maria Jose and Tim are all pioneering this building of capacity and networks within the Latino farmer community and identifying people who are real leaders in that space and offering training programs and conferences. And I've been working on my Spanish so that I can provide support and interact more with them. And it's, yeah, it feels like a great challenge. There's so many barriers to that particular audience. I mean, even more so than the barriers for anyone who wants to farm. And so that's something that we're looking forward to, trying to support the success of that community.
Well, that's a lot to look forward to. I have to ask you a quick question, though. I want to go back to mulberries. What in particular is good about consuming mulberries? Do you know, is there a health
Livestock.
part?
For humans to
Yeah,
consume them, for livestock?
both, either.
Well, for humans consuming the berries, I would assume that the berries, well, I know that they have a high level of protein, like more than most other berries. But I would also assume that they have some of the same benefits, the anthocyanins and things like that, that are in blueberries and other
Yeah,
nutrition.
yeah.
But for the livestock, that's, I sort of wish my colleague Connor was here because he would then talk your ear off for the next half hour about the many scientific studies that he's found about all of the amazing nutritional benefits that the leaves have for every kind of livestock that you could think of. And so like
Wow.
improving body condition of the livestock and improving their digestive health and their growth rates and everything.
You know, the reason I ask is I just came across goji berries. And it turns out that UC Davis is starting a trial, and it's going to be a clinical trial because they found that goji berries are loaded with the special compounds that are especially good for eye health. And by comparison, people are buying, $80 vitamins that are packed with a special mix. It turns out goji berries are much, much richer, and who knew that they did? And so what they're doing the clinical trial, so people will be on goji berries and tracking to see what impact it's happening on eye health. And I just wonder how many products like that are left that we think that, gee, we've looked at what's good about processed tomatoes and about something else, but what about mulberries and what about goji berries? And those are new frontiers for agriculture too.
Totally. Yep.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I like what you're doing a lot, and if people would like to know about your program, because I assume that you would let a Californian like me check it out and get some information. We've got people all over the country and actually outside of the United States that listen to Farm to Table Talk. Actually, I have a lot of listeners in New York State, so there'll be some folks that are involved directly in your program. But if they want more information, how do they find out what's available through Cornell in your small farm program?
The best source would be to go to our website, which is smallfarms.cornell.edu. And certainly, even though our focus tends to be on New York State residents, we have had people from all over the country and even from other countries who have benefited from our quarterly newspaper that we put out called the Small Farm Quarterly, from the online courses that we offer, from the other resources like the Guide to Farming that I mentioned. We have a YouTube channel that has all kinds of interesting videos on it on a range of topics, from farm business management to specific production techniques. We are on social media, of course. You'll find us on Instagram and Facebook. You can just look up Cornell Small Farms.
That sounds great. Well, listen, I really appreciate this conversation. We need to do it again sometime, but thank you for being on Farm to Table Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Rodger. This was great.